So my theme has been around building performance reimagined, which is about some of the ideas we've already talked about. Is if you are CIBSE, then you are in some way obliged to think about the role of buildings and building services on the broadest social canvas. So this idea of there is change around us, and actually what buildings and building services are really for is for the health, resilience, well-being of communities and people that you build them for. It's not really about anything else. And so if you kind of wind it all the way back to that, and then you think about what needs to happen into the future and what should buildings really be like, we wrote a report very early on in the year, right before the year. Actually, we published it as part of the launch, and said that actually, if you're thinking about buildings and you're thinking about buildings of the future, you should be thinking about creating a variety of spaces within them so that they can change either across the day or across the lifetime of the building, so you can use them for different purposes. And an example that I use is, in the pandemic, how hard did your house work as a gym, office, family space? I mean, it was for everything, right? And you used space in a very different way over the course of the day in the pandemic than we had traditionally done. A lot of people just kind of use their houses as dormitories for some part of the week. There's a piece about variety. There's a piece about connectedness. So as we move into a decarbonised world, we're very used to this idea that a utility is something that you buy and it is guaranteed to be delivered. But as we move to a more decentralised grid, perhaps as we collect water, and certainly as we move into the digital world, you get more of an idea that a building is a node on a network, and it might supply sometimes, and it might absorb, it might use sometimes. And so if you start thinking about a building as a connected node on a network as opposed to a leaf on a branch, you have a very different reaction or interaction with the systems that are around you. So there's a piece about connectedness, and some of the things that I think we need to do are really hard to change because they're deeply embedded. They're embedded by contract, they're embedded by custom, they're embedded by the way that we manage risk, they're embedded by the way the money comes from, they're embedded in the way in which we put buildings together. So this idea of connectedness is perhaps a way of trying to break down some of those things. There's a piece about readiness. People live through disasters, and actually your building can support you better or worse depending on how well that building is constructed and what you have thought about in terms of disasters coming. So when we've talked about sustainability, we kind of often assume that everything's always going to be the same. But when you think about resilience, it's like everything's always going to be the same, and then every now and then you're going to have a hurricane or an earthquake, or probably not a tornado, but a hurricane or an earthquake or a flood or something. And actually it's quite predictable. You probably know for where your building is what is most likely. And so if you think about what is most likely, you can design your building for that. So instead of designing solely for life safety, you might design for continuous operation after that event has actually begun. So there's a piece about readiness. That's our third axis. And then the last piece is about emergence. And for me, this is about, as things change. So you have new ideas. So we didn't think embodied carbon was important 10 years ago. And now we spend all our time thinking, not all our time, but a big proportion of our time thinking about embodied carbon. And the way in which moving from an operational carbon world to an embodied carbon world changes the way in which you think about design is huge. As a structural engineer, as a mechanical engineer, it changes even the sort of locus of real activity from the mechanical engineers, which is where it was when it was all about operational energy, to the structural engineers, which is where it all is when you're thinking about embodied carbon, because their stuff is the heavy bit of the building. So this idea that their ideas change. So the framework that we developed, connected variety, connectedness, readiness, and emergence, is sort of like, if you were thinking about your building into the future and you're thinking about building a new building, or you're thinking about doing a retrofit, perhaps thinking along those axes or along those dimensions would help you get a better brief. And if you can get a better brief that you can put into your capital project, then you can hold your capital project team accountable for the delivery of on time, on budget, and all of the other things that you put into that brief. And then you should be able to get a better operational building. So those are the ideas that I was putting out there. I also really think that engineers have agency, right? What are the biggest uses of what are the biggest places that we use carbon? What are the biggest places that we emit carbon in operations? And it's all to do with buildings and building services. There's industry as well, but the industry is carbon and steel. It's like, where is that going? Some of it's going into industry, but a lot of that is going into the buildings and the built environment. So as buildings engineers, we have massive agency, because the stuff that we use, the materials that we extract, and the environments that we create impact people directly, and they impact all of the things that we're worried about in our changing environment directly. So while you might not be thinking about that as you're sizing the beam or figuring out how thick the ductwork material sheet metal should be on your piece, actually there is a straight line, relatively straight line, that you can draw from the decision you're making now to the broader impact that you have in the world. What I would like engineers, building services engineers in particular, to have is a sense of that agency, a fact that they actually can control some of the things, maybe not very much, but that you can get a sense of purpose by controlling the bit that you control. So that's the sort of second thing that I wanted to get out of the presidency. And the third thing is this idea that careers are long. When I first started, people were drawing on paper, and it was a pretty manual process. The whole thing was a pretty manual process. And in the time that I've been working, we've moved from that, it's going to be kind of like this, to, let's do a parametric analysis against the outputs that we think that we want to have with the factors that we think that are important. And here's 55 ways that it could possibly be. And here's how we might evaluate them in order to be able to choose. Just the very way of thinking about the things that we might produce have the potential to be quite different. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's going to be something like this. But we have the opportunity to think about things in different ways. And because things have changed that fast over my lifetime, and I'm sure they're going to continue to change over the rest of my lifetime, that idea that stuff changes quite quickly, so you always have to be prepared for the next bit, is something that I would also like our engineers to be thinking about. How are you ready for what's next year, or 10 years time, or 20 years time? Because it won't be the exact same as what you're doing now. And that's something that I think as an engineering institution, if you want to be attractive to people who want to have careers, it's like you have to position them well for the 40 years that they are expected to be in the business. So those are the things that I was hoping to get out of it, and they all come from this idea of building performance reimagined. What should the building performance be like, and then how do engineers have to be and think in order to be able to achieve that? And what I'm hoping that I'll achieve kind of as legacy is that we are building some of those ideas into the CIBSE Forward strategy. It happens to be a strategy year. So we're thinking about how do we build in that kind of horizon scanning, thinking about the next thing, making sure we're positioning for people to have good and long careers in building services as part of the building services, and as part of CIBSE's kind of forward look.
And so where does your influence reach as the president currently? And how does that work when you look at the other leadership roles within CIBSE as an organization?
So the lovely thing about being president is that you gain a platform which you can use as much as you can manage, right? And I have used it. I've used it in every opportunity that I have been able to use it as an opportunity, consistent with having a day job. It is my reach as much as I would like? Of course not. I want to change the world, but there are places and people that you can reach that, and that we have tried to reach through different kinds of podcasts, through things that we've been writing, through presentations that we've had, through conferences that we've put on, through kind of just putting it in the water and seeing if anybody is able to kind of pick it up and run with it.
What's been your biggest surprise since being president?
I don't think I've really been surprised. I think that the organisation did a pretty good job of preparing me for what was going to come. So I don't think I'm actually surprised.
The reason I went down the road of using the word surprised is your role is very much involved with people, and I know people can be predictable, but I also know people can be unpredictable, and people can surprise in a good way and also in a bad way. And so I'm just wondering, with the influence that you have and the platforms that you've been on, I wonder if there's an outcome to say, oh, maybe that happened quicker than I thought, or maybe I didn't think it would go that way. I'm surprised I met this person. I'm just wondering if there's anything more from the people side of things.
So I don't think I was surprised by this, but I was really pleased to see when we were writing the report and putting the thinking together. I got an enormous amount of really strong support from people within Arup and within CIBSE. People got really excited about the idea and actually gave time and thought and expertise that improved the report way beyond what I was really thinking about when I first envisaged it. So I was definitely not exactly surprised, but really it was brilliant to see some of the work that people sort of helped and did, having seen the ideas and thinking that it was a good idea and thinking that that was the way forward. So that was very encouraging at the time, because it was the Building Performance Reimagined report is not a report that CIBSE would normally have put out. It says it right there at the beginning. This is not your technical guidance based on years of best practice. This is asking you to reimagine the future. And I didn't know how that was going to go. And I would say that it has gone better than it's gone better than it might have. And I've been really pleased by what people have seen in it and then been able to take away from it, because I never had an idea that I would be able to tell people how it was going to be into the future. What I wanted people to do was, what I wanted to do was to give people a little bit of agency and a little bit of inspiration for thinking about the future and then taking it in whatever direction they wanted to take it.
Thanks for watching to the end. I think that you'll like this, but before you do that, just make sure that you've commented and liked below, and also that you subscribed.